Hi, I'm Dale Wells. Welcome to Lesson 3 in our 13-lesson study of Moses, Face to Face with God. This is a Heritage Bible Masterclass study. Today we're in our third lesson, and we're looking at the Israelites at the Red Sea and standing firm in Exodus 14. The Heritage Bible Masterclass is a non-denominational group of senior adults who love the Lord and His Word. We meet at the Heritage Palms Country Club, south of Fred Waring, east of Jefferson Street in Indio, California, every Sunday morning at 10:15. We'd love to have you join us. Just let them know at the gate that you're there for the Bible study, and the guard will let you right in. Feel free to comment as you watch this video, and if you find these videos helpful, help me out by hitting the like button. Also, if you'll subscribe to the channel, you'll be notified whenever I post new material. We begin with a scripture reading today, which is the entirety of chapter 14 in the book of Exodus. Follow along with me.
Chapter 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal-zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." So the Israelites did this. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea, to divide the water, so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so that they will go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving, And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant.
As is our custom, I've put together some questions in our study guide. Incidentally, if you don't have a copy of the study guide, make a comment letting me know that you'd like one, and I'll be glad to send one to you. But here's the first of the 10 questions that I put together. Why did God give Moses precise directions? And when have you seen God get glory over his enemies using unconventional means? Well, God gave Moses specific directions to orchestrate a strategic entrapment that would maximize divine glory while demonstrating his absolute sovereignty over Egypt's military might. The Hebrew verb that's used here, kaved, means to be heavy or to gain glory, and it appears in verse 4 when God says, "I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host." The same word appears in verses 17 and 18, emphasizing that the primary purpose of all of this was theological rather than merely tactical. It was to reveal God's character and power both to Israel and Egypt. When he says in verses 17 and 18, "I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Now, if you back up into chapter 13, the last few verses tell us something about the way Israel was being led in the desert and how they came to this place to cross the Red Sea. Exodus 13 verses 21 and 22 tells us that by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. So the people of Israel are not really being led directly by Moses. Moses is being led by God as he leads the people of Israel. So God is the one leading the Israelites through the desert to this tactical place where they're going to cross the Red Sea. Now, scholars differ on the route the Israelites took out of Egypt. Numbers 33 verses 3 to 8 says that they went from Ramesses to Succoth, then to Etham, then to Pi-hahiroth, east of Baal-zephon near Migdol. The problem is we don't know for certain where any of these locations are other than Ramesses. So some people propose a northern route as depicted by the red line on this map. Others propose a central route as depicted by the green lines. The traditional view is that they traveled a southern route as is depicted by the teal line. And if that's the case, which I believe is likely, they headed southeast along the western side of the Gulf of Suez, which is an arm of the Red Sea. And the crossing would have been actually the crossing of the Gulf of Suez, which, as I said, is a part of the Red Sea. Now, according to Jewish tradition, specifically mentioned in the Art Scroll Stone edition of the Chumash, it's a commentary on Exodus 14, verse 8, the crossing of the Red Sea occurred on Nisan 21, which was the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Jewish sages deduced this from the chronology of events. On Nisan 15, Israel left Egypt and traveled from Ramesses to Succoth. On the 16th, they traveled from Succoth to Etham, and on the 17th from Etham to Pi-hahiroth. Then on the 18th, it was reported to Pharaoh that Israel had been gone for 3 days, and on the 19th and 20th, Pharaoh mustered his army and pursued Israel. And on the 21st day of the first month, Israel crossed the Red Sea. So, the sages of the Jews believed that it was 1 week from the time the Israelites left Egypt till the time they crossed the Red Sea. Now, this Chumash is a widely respected Jewish commentary that presents traditional rabbinic interpretations. So this would be an authoritative source for how the Jews believe the timing worked out for the time between the Passover on Nisan 14 and 15, which was the nighttime, and the Red Sea crossing 6 to 7 days later. But notice how God specifically positions the Israelites. They're to camp by Pi-hahiroth, near Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal-zephon. Now, what God did, and we can't be precisely sure exactly where these locations are, but he created what looked like a tactical error that would entice Pharaoh to pursue the Israelites. So, you read in Exodus 14, verse 3, that Pharaoh says they're wandering around the land in confusion. That's the way it would look to Egyptian intelligence. The Israelites are just kind of wandering around willy-nilly. They're trapped by geography and vulnerable to a cavalry attack. But God's divine strategy transforms what would appear to be the Israelite weakness into the stage for unprecedented supernatural intervention. This unconventional means involved using Israel's apparent vulnerability as bait, employing natural elements like wind and water as weapons, and timing the destruction to maximize the psychological impact on both the Israelites and the Egyptians. Unlike conventional military victories that are achieved through superior tactics or numbers, this deliverance would be unmistakably divine in origin and scope. And that's why God says, I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. There are all kinds of historical parallels showing how God uses unconventional means to accomplish his victory over his enemies. For example, Gideon, having a large army, decimated it down to just 300 men, and with those 300 men, they defeated the Midianite thousands through confusion rather than combat in Judges chapter 7. There's David, who takes a sling and conquers Goliath's armor in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And there's Jehoshaphat, who gains victory through worship rather than warfare in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. The point is this: each of these demonstrates that divine glory emerges most clearly when human resources prove inadequate and supernatural intervention becomes the only explanation for victory. Or as Charles Spurgeon put it, God's strength is made perfect in weakness, and his glory shines brightest when human resources fail and divine intervention becomes the only explanation for victory. Well, how did Pharaoh react when he was told that the Israelites had left? Why didn't he just cut his losses and let them go? We read in verse 5, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We've let the Israelites go and have lost their services. His reaction swift and decisive. He had a complete reversal of attitude, suggesting that previously his consent to let the people of Israel leave was either insincere or quickly regretted. What have we done? He's got immediate remorse, and he's just incredulous at the economic and political impact of letting these slaves leave. There are several factors that would prevent Pharaoh from accepting his losses. First, there are economic considerations. He's lost about 2 million slaves. That represents a catastrophic labor shortage affecting agriculture, construction, military projects. When he says we've lost our slaves, he uses an expression that suggests a permanent loss rather than a temporary loss. Second, his royal pride demanded vindication. He's been humiliated time and again through the 10 plagues. Now, the Egyptian pharaohs claimed to have divine status. So when they were defeated by a foreign god, politically and theologically, that was just intolerable. And he needed vindication. Then there was his military confidence in the Egyptian cavalry and chariot forces that led him to overconfidence. Verse 7 describes Pharaoh taking 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The idea of the officers refers to the elite chariot crews, indicating that this represents Egypt's finest military units. These are not just hastily assembled forces. Fourth, there are psychological factors, including what we call sunk cost fallacy. In other words, they'd invested so much in resisting Moses that surrender now is like admitting total defeat. We call it throwing good money after bad. It's a common reasoning error where people continue to invest time and money and effort into something because of what they've already invested, rather than just evaluating whether it makes sense to continue based on future cost and benefit analysis. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart in verse 8 represents both divine judicial action and human stubborn pride, refusing to accept divine sovereignty. Kenneth Kitchen writes this: ancient Near Eastern royal ideology required rulers to demonstrate strength and never appear weak before subjects of foreign powers. Matthew Henry's observation is this: pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And Pharaoh's pursuit of Israel exemplifies how earthly power often destroys itself through refusing to acknowledge divine authority. So how did the Israelites cope with their fears when the Egyptian army came after them? And when have you ever felt hopeless? Notice how the Israelites coped with their fear. Upon seeing the Egyptian forces, they were terrified and cried out to the Lord. The phrase, they feared greatly, or they panicked is the way the New Living Translation puts it, indicates overwhelming terror, while the crying out to the Lord was not prayer, it was desperate screaming. They're in panic mode. And then their fear quickly transforms into accusations, complaints against Moses. Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? What have you done to us? Why did you make us leave Egypt? It's a sarcastic question. Egypt was famous for elaborate burial practices and tombs, and so this complaint is both bitter and culturally pointed. Did you bring us out here because there weren't enough graves to bury us all in Egypt? It's an emphatic, rhetorical question. But most revealing is the way they idealized the Egyptian slavery. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Have you ever noticed how crisis can distort memory and perspective? And these people are saying they'd prefer certain slavery to uncertain freedom. They'd prefer known oppression to unknown deliverance. This response pattern, fear leading to blame, blame leading to nostalgia for previous bondage, reflects common human coping mechanisms under extreme stress. When we face overwhelming circumstances, people often romanticize the past. They say that was better than the present. They seek someone to blame rather than looking for solutions, and they allow fear to override their faith in spite of the previous evidences of God's divine faithfulness. and they prefer familiar misery to unfamiliar hope. Walter Brueggemann says this: the Israelites had witnessed 10 miraculous plagues demonstrating God's power over Egypt. Yet 3 days into wilderness travel, they assumed abandonment and death. This illustrates how quickly crisis can eclipse faith and how fear can make slavery appear preferable to freedom, when freedom requires trusting divine provision rather than human security. Or as Oswald Chambers says, fear makes us forget God's faithfulness and makes slavery seem better than the uncertainty of freedom. But divine deliverance often comes when human hope is exhausted. So how did Moses respond when the Egyptians were bearing down on the Israelites? Well, Moses responded with remarkable calm and faith-based leadership, offering both reassurance and theological perspective to the panicking Israelites. His response began with, "Do not fear," using an emphatic construction that could be translated, "Stop being afraid." This imperative directly counters their terror with authoritative confidence in divine protection. He then provided a threefold promise: stand firm and you'll see the deliverance of the Lord that He'll bring today. The idea of standing firm or taking your stand suggests military positioning in spite of lacking weapons or tactical advantage. The phrase, the salvation of the Lord or the deliverance of the Lord, emphasizes that it's divine rather than human action that's going to come to the rescue. The theological climax appears in Moses' declaration: the Egyptians you see today you will never see again. This prophecy demonstrates Moses' complete confidence in God's promise, and it provides specific, verifiable hope to sustain faith during crisis. The phrase, "you will not continue to see them," indicates that they will be permanently gone, not just a temporary relief. Verse 14 contains the essential principle of divine warfare. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. The verb will fight is an active imperfect tense, indicating that God is going to continue to fight for them. It's ongoing divine military action. When he says, "you will be silent" or "you will be still," that commands human restraint from interference. In other words, you don't get in the way. God is going to handle this. Moses' response demonstrates several key leadership principles. First, notice he remained calm under pressure. He communicated his confidence in divine promises. He provided specific hope for this immediate crisis. And he shifted their focus from human inadequacy to divine adequacy. And then he commanded the appropriate human response: you stand firm, you remain still. Moses' faith-based leadership transformed panic into patient expectation of supernatural intervention. Or as John Maxwell says, true leadership in crisis means standing firm in faith while remaining still enough to let God fight the battles that are beyond human ability to win. So what did God say to Moses to get the Israelites moving? Well, God's response to Moses revealed that while the people needed to stand firm, they also needed to move forward into active obedience. The divine question, "Why are you crying out to me?" suggests that Moses had joined the people in desperate prayer rather than implementing divine instructions. When God says, "Why do you cry out to me?" that indicates that the time for prayer is past and the moment for action has arrived. When he tells the Israelites to move forward, The verb means to break camp, the same term used throughout the wilderness narratives for the divinely directed travel. This wasn't just physical movement, it was covenant obedience to divine guidance, despite seemingly impossible circumstances. God then provided Moses with specific actions to facilitate the miracle. Raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water. Stretching out his hand appeared throughout the plague narratives, establishing Moses' rod as the instrument of divine power. The phrase, divide the sea, uses terminology suggesting a violent splitting of the sea rather than a gentle parting. The purpose statement appears in verses 17 and 18. I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. The repetition of I will be glorified, I will gain glory, emphasizes that Israel's deliverance serves the larger purpose of revealing divine character to the nations. This is not just about saving Israel. This is about showing God's glory. Carol Meyer says this: the balance between standing firm in faith and moving forward in obedience illustrates that biblical faith requires both trust and action, patience and progress. As Hudson Taylor says, faith is not a passive waiting for God to act, but an active stepping forward in obedience when God has spoken, even when the path seems impossible. So Moses tells the people there to stand firm, while God tells Moses to have them move on. How is it possible to do both at the same time? The apparent contradiction between standing firm in verse 13 and moving on in verse 15 resolves when we understand these commands as sequential phases of faith-based action, rather than simultaneous contradictory instructions. The verbs address different aspects of faithful response to crisis: inner spiritual posture and outer obedient action. Standing firm carries military connotations of taking a defensive position, maintaining courage under attack, and refusing to flee in panic. The Israelites must actively position themselves for divine intervention rather than just passively waiting. This involves spiritual resolve, emotional stability, and confidence in God's promises, despite overwhelming circumstances. The New Living Translation captures this sense. Stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. Moving on describes the covenant community's characteristic response to divine guidance throughout the wilderness period. This verb appears over 150 times in the Pentateuch, indicating that God directed the travel, according to the cloud and fire manifestations leading Israel. The command to move on requires active obedience despite apparent impossibility. God tells them essentially, walk into the sea. They don't have boats, they don't have bridges, they don't have alternative routes, but God says, walk into the sea. Spiritual standing firm enables physical moving forward. Inner confidence in divine faithfulness provides the foundation for outer obedience to divine commands. Faith encompasses both dimensions: the steadfast spirit that maintains hope during crisis, and walking in faith that translates trust into action. How does this work in our contemporary situation? Well, it involves things like standing firm in biblical truth while moving forward in ministry opportunities, maintaining doctrinal convictions while adapting methods to changing circumstances, holding fast to our core values while embracing necessary change, and preserving spiritual stability while pursuing growth. Brevard Child says this: the Red Sea paradigm teaches that effective Christian living requires both rootedness and responsiveness, firmness and flexibility, conviction and courage to advance when God opens doors. Martin Luther wrote this in his preface to the Epistle of Romans: faith is a living, daring confidence in God's grace, so sure and certain that one could stake his life on it 1,000 times. Who protected the Israelites from the Egyptian army? Well, the angel of God and the pillar of cloud provided divine protection by repositioning themselves between Israel and Egypt's advancing army. The idea that they got up from the front of the camp and moved to the back of the camp indicates that there was a deliberate relocation. This wasn't just a random movement. This was strategic divine intervention at the crucial moment. The angel of God is a theophany. It's a manifestation of the divine presence in an accessible form, not just an ordinary heavenly messenger. Throughout the Old Testament, this figure appears in critical moments, providing guidance, protection, and divine communication in places like Genesis 16 and Genesis 22 and Exodus chapter 3. The English Standard Version maintains angel of God, but the Net Bible clarifies: the angel of God who was going before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud served multiple protective functions. It provided a physical barrier, preventing the Egyptians from approaching the Israelites. It created darkness on Egypt's side while maintaining light for Israel. It demonstrated the visible divine presence that encouraged the Israelites' faith. The phrase that they came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel emphasizes divine positioning as the protector and the separator. I love this expression in verse 20 that describes the supernatural light and darkness division. There was darkness and light. Indicates a simultaneous opposing condition that affects the same geographical area but different armies. The miracle parallels the ninth plague, when there was darkness that could be felt in Exodus 10 verse 1, but that darkness stopped right at the border of Goshen where the Israelites lived. And so the Egyptians were in darkness while the Israelites were in the light. Here we see the same thing happening as in the ninth plague. So the divine protection strategy demonstrates several theological principles. One, God fights for his people through supernatural means rather than conventional warfare. Then there's the fact that the divine presence adapts to circumstances that require different kinds of intervention. He doesn't always do the same thing the same way every time. Then the fact is that protection may involve separation rather than destruction. And so here, there's separation from the hostile forces rather than destroying them, at least at this moment. And then there's the fact that God's timing coordinates multiple elements: the movement of the cloud, the sea, the wind direction, for comprehensive deliverance. The same God who guides us forward also guards us from behind, positioning himself between his people and their enemies with perfect timing and absolute power. What miraculous events took place at the Red Sea? The Red Sea crossing involved multiple interconnected miracles, demonstrating unprecedented divine control over natural elements. The primary miracle was the division of the sea itself. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The strong east wind describes a supernatural wind in intensity and duration that exposed the sea bottom as dry land. But then the water formation created protective walls. Notice the waters were divided and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The word for wall, the Hebrew word choma, typically describes city fortifications, suggesting a vertical water mass rather than gradual slopes. This terminology emphasizes the supernatural nature of the event. Water maintained its structural integrity despite defying gravitational forces. The repetition in verse 29 reinforces this miraculous aspect. Now, the place where this took place is likely the Gulf of Suez. It's 12 miles wide and 230 feet deep at its narrowest point. To give some perspective to this, a standard 20-story building is 230 feet high. So, imagine walking in Manhattan between skyscrapers. Now, imagine that the walls are walls of water rather than steel and stone and glass, and they're standing straight up 230 feet high, defying gravity and all known natural processes. That's what the Israelites did. The miracle coordinated multiple elements. There was the wind that blew throughout the night. There was the complete removal of water before the Egyptian pursuit, so that you had walls of water, not mounds of water. There were the Israelites crossing on dry ground through darkness while maintaining visibility because of the pillar of fire. There was the precise timing of the return of the water as the Egyptians reached the middle of the sea. The phrase, "toward morning, the sea returned to its normal depth," indicates supernatural timing, not coincidental phenomena. The Egyptian destruction involved divine warfare. The Lord threw the Egyptians into the sea, verse 27 says. That suggests violent action. Verse 24 describes divine confusion in the Egyptian ranks. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so they had difficulty driving. This supernatural interference with the Egyptian military equipment demonstrates direct divine intervention in the battle. The comprehensive result was total Egyptian military destruction. Not one of them survived, verse 28 says. Archaeological evidence from various periods shows that Egyptian military records typically excluded references to defeats, making this complete annihilation historically significant. The phrase, "not one of them remained," emphasizes the totality of divine judgment while highlighting Israel's complete preservation. The Red Sea crossing demonstrates that when God intervenes in history, natural laws become servants of divine purposes rather than obstacles to divine plans. So while God does the fighting for Israel, Moses is required to stretch out his hand. What insights does this provide for standing firm? Moses' role of stretching out his hand while God performs the miracle illustrates the essential partnership between divine sovereignty and human obedience in spiritual leadership. The phrase, "stretch out your hand," appears at crucial moments throughout the narrative. Verse 16, verse 21, verse 26, verse 27, indicating that human action serves as the trigger for divine intervention while God provides all the power. The rod in Moses' hand represents delegated divine authority not inherent human power. Throughout Exodus, this same rod produces miracles before Pharaoh, brings plagues upon Egypt, and now it divides the sea, but only when it's wielded in obedience to divine command. The rod symbolizes that spiritual leadership effectiveness depends upon divine anointing rather than human skill or training or natural ability. The timing is crucial. Moses must stretch out his hand precisely when God commands, maintain the position through Israel's crossing, and repeat the action to restore the waters. This requires sustained obedience under pressure, faith when circumstances appear unchanged, and persistence despite physical strain. The Hebrew narrative emphasizes these repeated actions rather than treating them as single events. The visibility of Moses' actions provided encouragement to 2 million crossing Israelites and terror to pursuing Egyptians. When people see spiritual leaders actively depending upon God through prayer, worship, and obedient action, their faith increases. Conversely, when leaders try to accomplish ministry through purely human methods, divine power becomes absent and efforts fail. There are a number of leadership principles that emerge. Spiritual leaders must act in faith while recognizing God as the source of all results. Human obedience triggers divine intervention, but never controls or manipulates it. Leadership requires sustained, faithful action rather than momentary, heroic gestures. Visible dependence upon God encourages others, while building their confidence in divine power. And effective ministry combines human responsibility with divine sovereignty rather than replacing one with the other. Gerald Jansen says this: contemporary application involves pastors preaching faithfully while trusting God for transformation, missionaries sharing the gospel while depending upon the Spirit for conversion, counselors providing biblical wisdom while relying upon divine healing, and teachers instructing students while praying for spiritual understanding. As A.W. Tozer says, the leader's hand must be raised in dependence while God's hand moves in power. For ministry is neither purely divine action that ignores human responsibility, nor purely human action that ignores divine sovereignty. If you'd been one of the Israelites who experienced this event, how would you have described it to someone who wasn't there? As an Israelite eyewitness, I would describe the Red Sea crossing as the most terrifying and magnificent event in human history. A night when the God of Abraham literally fought Egypt's army and won. I would begin by explaining the impossible situation. 600 Egyptian chariots pursuing us with nowhere to flee. The sea blocking our path and our children crying as death approached us from behind. I would describe the supernatural darkness that separated us from the Egyptians, how we could see clearly while they groped in midnight blackness just yards away. The Hebrew phrase would echo in my memory. The angel of God literally stood between us and annihilation, protecting us through the cloud that brought light to us and darkness to our enemies. I would try to convey the impossibility of what we witnessed. Moses stretching his rod toward the sea while an east wind of supernatural strength began howling. Water receding slowly until massive walls of sea stood upright on both sides and dry ground appearing where moments before lay deep water. The Hebrew term choma, or wall, cannot capture the reality. Imagine city walls made of water towering above our heads, held in place by invisible divine power. I would describe our hesitation. Who wants to walk between liquid walls that could collapse at any moment? Followed by our desperate faith as Egyptian war cries grew closer. 2 million people with livestock and possessions walking across what had been sea bottom just hours before, and the ground was firm, not muddy. as if God had prepared our pathway for generations. I would tell them about the Egyptian destruction, how we heard their chariots pursuing us into the seabed, the confusion in their ranks as God jammed their wheels, their screams as water walls collapsed precisely when the last Israelite reached safety. By morning, bodies of our oppressors washed onto the shore. Not one of them survived. But most importantly, I would describe how this experience transformed our understanding of God. We had heard stories about Abraham's faith and Jacob's wrestling, but we witnessed the God of our fathers demonstrating his absolute power over the greatest empire on earth. The phrase, "they believed in the Lord and in Moses his servant," captures our response. Faith born from overwhelming evidence of divine love and power. As Frederick Buechner said, there are moments in history when heaven touches earth so powerfully that all who witness can only fall in worship, knowing they have seen the hand of God reshape reality itself. Well, that's our look at the experience at the Red Sea, standing firm. In our next lesson, the people of Israel will come to Mount Sinai, and they will meet with God. I hope you'll join us. In the meantime, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.